When the Dallas Mavericks made that blockbuster trade to bring in Kyrie Irving after Kyrie had demanded a trade from the Brooklyn Nets, the thought for most was that this was going to be a disaster, a train wreck waiting to happen. The Dallas Mavericks had already been struggling leading up to the trade deadline, hovering around 500 or slightly above 500 at that time, which was disappointing when you consider the fact that this was a team that had just gone to the Western Conference Finals and had a top 5 player in the league on their roster who continues to get better with every passing season. And for a team that was bereft of defense, a team that lacked true leadership, veteran voices, and a team that has struggled to have an identity, especially without the services of Jalen Brunson, who they let walk in free agency, you added Kyrie Irving, of all people, to pair alongside Luka Doncic. Kyrie Irving, an incredibly talented player, a gifted athlete and scorer, one of the better ball handlers we've seen in NBA history, but a player who does not complement the skills of Luka and is by no means what you would consider to be a leader nor a good presence in the locker room just based on his history with prior teams. And yet, the Mavericks somehow thought this was going to work out in a desperation move to make Luka happy, bringing in a player who is going to become a free agent. As reports have indicated, there is no talk of an extension at the moment that Kyrie Irving is seeking with the Dallas Mavericks. The Mavs thought it was going to work, and wouldn't you know it, it's blowing up in their faces with the real possibility of the Mavericks not only missing the playoffs, but potentially even missing the play-in entirely. But more recently, you have now had more people saying, hey, Kyrie isn't the problem. Jason Kidd isn't the problem. The roster as a whole is not the problem. Luka Doncic is the problem on the Dallas Mavericks. He's the reason the Mavericks are underperforming, and he's the one who should be held accountable for their play. A narrative that keeps on evolving as we all try to figure out what is going on in Dallas. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy this type of content, then feel free to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I very much appreciate the support, and in return, I'll be providing more NBA content like this. Now, it's no secret that the Dallas Mavericks have been arguably the most disappointing team this season in the NBA relative to their expectations. I would say even more disappointing than teams like the Minnesota Timberwolves, the Atlanta Hawks, or even the Chicago Bulls, because unlike some of the aforementioned teams, none of them made a deep run in the playoffs last season. None of them had a true bona fide superstar that is a consensus top 5 player in the NBA, and also none of these teams are likely going to be missing the play-in entirely. And while yes, it's easy to poke fun at the fact that they traded for Kyrie Irving when most knew that combination of Kyrie and Luka wasn't going to work, the fact of the matter is when a team grossly underperforms, the primary blame and accountability lies on the team's best players, in this case Luka Doncic. I'm not saying that's fair, because there is plenty of blame to go around in Dallas, which I'll get to, but when things really start going wrong, people start to point the finger at the team's best player. Now, don't get me wrong, Luka should not be absolved of any blame for the Mavericks' failures this season. No one is saying he's perfect, and as good as he is, there are aspects of his game for which negatively impact the team, specifically his defense, or more so, the lack of effort for which he puts forth on defense. The fact that Luka, while so gifted offensively, controls the game and overall flow of the offense, he oftentimes gets too much tunnel vision and just creates ISO plays for himself. He also doesn't trust in his teammates most of the time. But those downsides aside, for me, the bigger issue is how Luka carries himself on the floor and the negative impact that has on the rest of the team. Look, there is no question that Luka should be frustrated with how things are transpiring this season. And it's hard to look happy, be positive, and bring a ton of energy to the court when your team is struggling and you don't really have much in the way to work with for the future. But that doesn't mean you can't still be an effective leader and doing your best to make your teammates better despite the circumstances you find yourselves in. And yes, Luka has to trust his teammates more, and he needs to not be so ball dominant. Everything can't just go through him on offense. That's never going to work. But here's what I take issue with when people say that Luka is the problem. First of all, people love to harp on his defense. You heard Kendrick Perkins say he can't guard a parked car. And while yes, Luka is a subpar defender, no one would ever say that he's a good defender by any means. And yes, his effort overall on the defensive end should be better, because even if you're not the best defender, the least you can do is try on that end of the floor. What people don't realize though is that Luka is actually having one of the better defensive seasons of his career, again, for him, so take that with a grain of salt. He's right around league average in terms of defensive rating. He's still a positive when it comes to defensive box plus minus and defensive win shares, which is saying something considering the Mavs overall are an awful team on defense, boasting a defensive rating of 116, good for 23rd in the league. And usually, if your team is not that good on defense, your individual defensive numbers are not going to correlate well either. He's also averaging the most steals per game of his career, as well as the most deflections per game of his career. Again, you have to take advanced metrics with a grain of salt when you also factor in a player's overall usage and minutes as well as the team's performance. But the point is, Luka, while yes, not a great defender, he isn't as awful on defense as some people make him out to be, and I would argue some of his teammates are actually far worse defenders than he is. Second, you cannot sit there and tell me that Luka is the problem when you look at the construction of this Mavericks roster, especially post Kyrie Irving trade. They were already a bad defensive team, and you made it worse on the defensive end by making that move for Kyrie. On top of that, they have little to no depth in that second unit aside from Christian Wood when he's coming off the bench. You look at the bench and you see guys like Frank Ntilikina, Josh Green, Davis Bertans, JaVale McGee, Justin Holiday. I mean, when Kyrie and Luka go to sit on the bench for a breather, this team is getting clobbered with the lack of talent they have in their second unit. Like, as much as some want to point the blame at Luka, the front office and Mark Cuban as the owner have done a horrendous job at building around a once-in-a-generational level talent. They let Jalen Brunson walk, which, as I've said before, maybe wasn't entirely their fault considering the Knicks clearly tampered in stealing away Brunson and were penalized a second-round pick for it. But losing Brunson was a massive blow to this team. And then you look at all the other pieces, what they got in that trade for Porzingis, the very questionable contracts they've given out to guys like Tim Hardaway Jr., JaVale McGee, a 3-year deal for a player in his mid-30s who is barely even playable at this point in his career. Maxi Kleber, that extension. They've got Bertans' contract on the books for the next 2 seasons. And now that they've traded away more draft capital to get Kyrie, including an unprotected pick in 2029, the Mavs don't have much to work with for the future with the limited cap flexibility they have, especially if they plan on extending Kyrie Irving, and also with the limited draft capital they have to make enticing trades for the future. The Mavs don't even have their pick for this upcoming draft unless it falls into the top 10, which I guess now could be a possibility. So are we really going to blame Luka, who the Mavs were fortunate enough, due to other teams' incompetence of not recognizing the immense talent that he has, like the Kings and the Hawks did in 2018, or even the Suns for that matter? The front office, while they pulled off a genius move to land Doncic in 2018, despite going into the night only having the 5th overall pick, have been horrible in putting the right pieces around him after that. You know he's not a good defender. You know that he's one of the most gifted scorers and playmakers on offense in the NBA. How do you not put defenders around him and sharpshooters that will draw double teams away from him? How do you make a trade for Kyrie Irving when the man has been nothing but toxic in recent years? And even the toxicity aside, it's not going to be a star player that complements Luka's game. It's just absolutely baffling to me. And then finally, say what you will about Luka's lack of leadership. His demeanor, his body language on the court, complaining to the rest, none of that is a good look, and it is going to negatively impact the team. That being said though, let's not forget that Luka just turned 24 years of age. I don't want to give him a pass because it's not like he's 19, but 24 is still very young, still immature. I don't know about you guys, but when I was 24, I was nowhere near as level-headed and professional as I am now. I know it's giving him a pass, but leadership, how you carry yourself, making your teammates better, that comes with time and maturity. You can't expect a 24-year-old to be acting like a veteran leader out there and setting better example for others. Yeah, it would be nice, and there are some players who already have those traits at that age, but it's not uncommon for a younger player to be behaving this way, especially in a very frustrating circumstance they find themselves in where they don't see a path to contention in the near future. Oh, and the other piece that I'll add when people talk about how Luka is fat and overweight, that he clearly doesn't care about maintaining his health and physical strength to be competitive on the court, which impacts his defense and staying in front of guys. Like, come on now. The dude's a professional athlete that has reached the pinnacle of his craft. He's not fat nor overweight and is probably in far better shape than 99% of all of us who watch the NBA. Yeah, I don't buy that narrative for a second. So look, in short, yes, Luka deserves some of the criticism and blame for the Mavs' failed season. But is he the sole problem or even most of the problem? No, absolutely not. Not when you look at the circumstances surrounding this poorly constructed roster, the fact that they hired a coach who has shown he isn't fit to be a good head coach in the NBA, decent assistant but not a good head coach, and the fact that they lost a key piece to their success in Jalen Brunson. And now, the Mavs are doing everything in their power to scramble and keep Luka happy before he demands a trade. I would love to hear what you guys think though. Let me know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.